Okay, so I'll just start. So I'm Richard Ma. I'm the CEO of QuantStamp. So what I'm presenting here is based on research from our one of our senior engineers, Martin Durka, and it's about flash loans and economic attacks. So to start, I'm just gonna give a quick explainer on AMMs because it's needed for the rest of the talk. So AMMs is basically a way to do trading on the blockchain, and it's really simple. It has two pools. So in this example, we have 500 DAI in the pool and 500 USDC. And it's kind of like a know-nothing market maker. So if there's 500 DAI and 500 USDC, then the price is just 1 DAI per USDC in this example. So things like Uniswap, it just kind of does that. So now if we were to increase the number of DAI by 4 times, so if we had 2,000 DAI, then the price of DAI would also become cheaper in the AMM. So now 4 DAI could get you 1 USDC. But really, AMM, they have this curve, and based on the curve, it gets you the price of the asset in the pool. But this is kind of the intuition for it. So now we're just going to go through our first example for how to mitigate economic attacks. So first, I'm just going to go through this example with Alice and Mallory, and maybe instead of Alice and Mallory, we can use David and Richard. So in this example, we got an aggregator. So that's like a yield aggregator, like Yearn, and then an AMM. So AMM could be like SushiSwap or Uniswap, for example. So we have the aggregator pool, which invests money into the AMM, and we're going to basically contribute a single asset, DAI, to the aggregator, and then it's going to invest the money. And in this example, David's just going to use the aggregator. I'm going to try to exploit it. So in the beginning of the example, Alice, so David, he puts in 50 DAI into the aggregator, and the aggregator basically invests that, so they take, half of that, 25 DAI, and 25 USDC as LP tokens for the aggregator. There's like a little bit of price impact and slippage, but just for simplicity, let's say, David just got 25 DAI and 25 USDC. So now, I'm going to come along, and basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a really large trade where I sell a lot of DAI for USDC, and before the ratio of the pool was 1-to-1, and after my really big trade, it's going to be 4 DAI to 1 USDC. So now DAI is going to become very cheap. But the aggregator still holds the 25 LP tokens from the AMM. So from the aggregator perspective, they still have kind of the same number of LP tokens, except now David's balance is going to be 40 DAI and 10 USDC instead of what David had before, which is 25 DAI and 25 USDC. So then now I'm going to come along, Richard, and I'm going to deposit also 50 DAI into the aggregator, which is there's a ton of aggregators in DeFi now, and I'm also going to get 50 aggregator tokens. So this is Y DAI or one of those. But because the price in the AMM has changed, I'm going to get a different number of LP tokens. So whenever I put money in, the aggregator just invests the money into the AMM. So instead of like the 25 LP tokens that David got, I'm just gonna get 15.6 LP tokens. So I'm actually kind of like getting less LP tokens. Like I'm relatively speaking losing money on the aggregator side. And it's just because DAI is cheaper now. So you know, something is kind of weird, right? We both deposited the same amount of money, but we're getting different balances now. So now, what I can do is that I can go and basically purchase a bunch of DAI on the actual AMM side, and I can make a profit. So on the AMM side, I can make $18.75 in profit, and you know, on the aggregator side, this is going to basically move the AMM price back to 1 DAI to 1 USDC. And I'm going to lose around $9 on the aggregator side. So here I made $18. There I lost $9. What the heck happened? Well, basically David lost $9.
No.
Yeah, because it's kind of all zero sum in this case. There's only 2 people. So, you know, David lost $9. I lost $9 here too. We both lost $9. But I made $18 basically buying from the AMM. Basically, I was manipulating the AMM, made a profit there. And so it's kind of a successful attack. So the root cause of the attack is because the aggregator is making these single-sided deposits into the AMM and tracking the share positions here. So this is kind of like the simple principle of how these attacks are possible. So, you know, there's many variations of this attack, which just happens like every other week. But the basic example is a user deposits in an aggregator, which invests into an AMM or some other project which has a shifting price. An attacker, so in this case myself, I use a large amount of funds to change the price of the ratio of assets in the AMM. Then I deposit it to the aggregator, and then I, you know, reverse the change in price of AMM, and then I withdraw from the aggregator. And there's many types of variants. Usually, you know, these things are executed via flash loans, and it happens atomically, so you can't really interfere. And you know, you need like a large amount of profit to cover it. So sometimes the attacks don't happen right away. They wait until there's like a large amount of profit. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to cover techniques that our customers bring to us when we kind of bring up these economic attacks that we found in their contracts, and talk about, you know, the drawbacks of each approach. None of these techniques really work, and the theory of our engineers is that there's kind of no universal approach to solve economic attacks. So I'll kind of just talk through it and some basic principles and some best practices. So first, so there's 5, there's oracle checks, preventing smart contract interactions, block blocking, which means not allowing multiple transactions in the same block, added fees, and added limits. So, oracles. So, you know, whenever there's a flash loan attack, you check the Twitter thread, and people are like, oh, I should have used the oracle, why did you use Chainlink? So, I'm kind of going to just talk about some basic reasons why. So the whole idea of using Oracle is that you have this on-chain price source via the AMM, and you're allowing users to deposit. So can you check with the off-chain price source to just make sure the price is sane, and if the price of the AMM differs by a lot from the Oracle, then you revert the transaction. That's the idea. So, here's just a little graph. So at T0, the Oracle basically has a certain price that it's kind of getting from the market. And then, sometimes there's a big trade that just naturally happens in the market. So at T1, there's a delta, which is, that's kind of how stale the price is. So the Oracle, it's basically always stale because it's getting some data from the market. And if there's a big trade, then now the real market is different from what the Oracle price is. It could be caused by some whale buying a lot of tokens, or just a lot of people selling. Happens all the time in crypto. And so now this Oracle is behind, and it's going to be behind until the keepers of the Oracle notice and submit another transaction to update the Oracle. So this is basically the window of opportunity when the AMM can be manipulated towards the stale price of the Oracle. So it can be manipulated towards T0, which is the stale price. And this window is always going to exist. So if it's a really large trade or a large transaction, then you can squeeze another transaction in between T1 and T0. And this is basically why the Oracle check is not a cure for flash loans. The Oracle data is always going to be stale. So the attacker just needs to wait until there's favorable market conditions to pull off the attack. So now there's a question, because what about virtual price or like TWAP or other things like that? Well, virtual price and TWAP are also just oracles, so they're also stale, and TWAP are kind of stale by definition. So it's basically attempts for the smart contract to get the true price, and that's always going to be stale. So you can always manipulate it towards the stale price. So once these projects that we talk to, they realize, oh, maybe oracles don't really solve the problem, or it's a problem with maintaining oracle liveness. Then they try to have some other measures to prevent flash loans, and a very frequent one is to disable smart contract interaction. So the whole idea is, you need the smart contract to claim the flash loan, and if you can't use smart contracts, maybe that's going to save your project. But this is not really true, because anyone who is active on Ethereum knows that there's just sandwich attacks and MVV. And these sandwich attacks, you basically submit transactions to the miners that happen in a certain order, and the miners basically get paid to execute a transaction in that order. This happens all the time. So if you pull up any DEX and try to do a big trade, you'll get sandwiched. And it's really the same principle. So all you do is you just need a bit of money to do the attack yourself instead of borrowing it. And usually 10 to 300 million is enough. But who has so much money just lying around to do hacks, right? Well, now the hackers have a lot of money. So these are just some hacks that I pulled from Rect. There's a lot that is in like the mid 8 figures range, and this is actually enough to pull off a lot of hacks without using flash loans. So I think like maybe from early 2020 or 2019, there was the illusion that bad people didn't have so much money to pull off these attacks, and that you could kind of, if you disable smart contract interactions, you could prevent it. But really, we shouldn't have any illusions anymore that these hackers don't have the funds to do these attacks. And if you still object that, okay, these attacks are unlikely, well, the other downside of disabling smart contract interactions is that multi-sigs would also be disabled. So if you wanted to have projects like multi-sigs interact with your yield aggregator or other DeFi Lego, then now you're disabling them if you disable all these interactions. So the third one that I think some developers try is called block blocking. So the whole idea is just to make it so that you can't interact with the project multiple times in the same block. But the problem is, if you look at how these attacks work, there's kind of 4 steps. First, you manipulate the external money Lego in the AMM, and then you make a deposit into the yield aggregator or the kind of that project that's sending funds to the other project, and then you restore the AMM, and then you collect the profits, right? And steps A to C, these are time-sensitive steps. So you got to manipulate that, deposit, withdraw. But step D, where you collect the money, it's not time-sensitive. So you can do that later. And if you look at where it's manipulating it, well, steps A to C, this is in the AMM. So this is some external project. And it's not doing block blocking. So only step B and D is doing the block blocking, and these don't have to happen in the same transaction or even the same block. This can happen, 30 minutes later. So it actually doesn't work, this idea. So sounds good, but it doesn't work. So another idea is deposit withdrawal fees. So what if we just charge more deposit withdrawal fees for something like really short-term deposit and withdrawal, and maybe that will ruin the profitability of the attack. But again, this doesn't always work. So in our original example, I used a lot of funds to move the AMM, but not to deposit into the yield aggregator. So the AMM is not charging a ton of deposit and withdrawal fees. It just charges a little bit of trading fees. So, I can basically take 300 million, stick that into the AMM, move it around, or even more, and then just put a smaller amount of money into the yield aggregator and still come out with a profit, and just repeat that. So to basically pull out this attack, I just need to wait until this aggregator has more TVL, and at some point it could become profitable. So I'm basically just kind of tracking what the profit is of the aggregator and making sure that it's profitable. But due to the way these attacks are carried out, moving the AMM is kind of the part that really requires a lot of assets. So that's kind of that approach. And the last one that we've seen is basically limiting the deposit. I've seen this one less just from our customers because people want to get a lot of TVL and adoption for the project. But there's been some kind of safe, more safeguarded launches. So it is good to try. If you start a new project, I think having a guarded launch is always a very good idea. But it doesn't really work because you can just kind of hit the pool repeatedly. So you can do it 300 times. So if smart contracts were allowed, you can make an arbitrarily large number of accounts and attack through them. You don't need to use just one account, or you can make a bot that just iterates through many different hits, and maybe each time you get $10,000, $20,000, and you just do that 500 times or until whenever the project realizes that this is happening and tries to stop it. So, what works? Some of our research engineers, like we've been trying to basically talk to projects and help them. And so one thing that does work is to not have single-sided pools. So if you're an aggregator or a DeFi Lego that is using another DeFi Lego, have the users deposit the raw LP tokens from the AMM instead of the assets. Right, so in the first example, we had the users deposit DAI, which like the aggregator is converting and using the share price. Now, if they just deposited the sushi or uni LP tokens, that would have prevented the attack. The second one is to not issue pool shares based on trades or AMMs. So pool shares are things like YDAI, things that are tracking how many shares you have of the aggregator. So if you could create the LP token before making a deposit, that would kind of solve or help you solve this problem, because these pool shares could be inaccurate, right? You could be making pool shares based on an inaccurate price, temporary price. So you could be making more shares than you actually wanted to. And lastly, like this is the advice we always give, is don't take other people's money into a trade. So really when you deposit from the aggregator to the AMM, it's kind of a trade. There is actually some price slippage as well. So if you're providing leverage for a single-sided deposit, the attacker, so myself, I could trigger the project from basically taking someone else's money together with mine and doing a leverage trade, right? So depositing basically even more assets. So it's kind of like levering up what I could bring to the table. And this could, kind of imbalance the project even more. And also, we recommend to not unwrap LP tokens that don't belong to myself. So, if I'm performing withdrawal, we don't want to also unwrap other people's deposits at the same time to basically reduce my leverage. And we've seen this kind of a lot of times, and it's, the basic idea is to try to get more yield for people by providing leverage, but it's quite tricky. So, and so there is, one solution, which is centralization and whitelisting. So if you had a trusted party execute some of these sensitive actions, that could prevent some of these problems. But is that really DeFi? So we've also seen some projects that do some whitelisting for some of those kind of solutions 1 to 5. They set the oracles that's whitelisted, or they set certain projects that are allowed to interact. So that's kind of a pretty common approach to basically have the multi-sig or the project admin be able to set some of those things. That's about it. So thanks a lot. So the original creator of the talk is Martin at QuantStamp.com. So if you have more questions, feel free to email them. And to just learn more about MEV, NFTs, DeFi hacks, we have a pretty awesome blog maintained by our communications team. And yeah, we just launched a German subsidiary in Munich. And I'm a very active investor in DeFi as well. So yeah, feel free to just reach out. Any questions? Sure. Yep.
Hey, so you mentioned, this was all about economic attacks, and I know there's a lot of tools for avoiding like code bugs, like formal analysis and fuzzing and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Are there any good like tools or approaches for like trying to understand economic vulnerabilities that you might have encountered?
I think the best approach that I've seen is actually just for projects to go through previous attacks. Because there's actually there's lists of them. Like Rec has lists. There's quite a lot of lists of previous attacks. And the most common thing that we've seen in audits is that people aren't actually reading through what happened in previous exploits. So they'll kind of fork some aggregator or some DEX, but they won't look at, okay, what audits have happened and what did the audits bring up. Because for a lot of these hacks, they kind of happened because they didn't look at the audit report of the code they forked. And there was some subtle thing that the auditors brought up in the report that kind of led to their subsequent exploit. So that's kind of the best resource, actually. I would say the best resource is going through the recent hacks. There's been 30 of them. Understanding how they work, and if you're devising something to try to prevent the hack, don't think you came up with a genius solution because within that lot. It's oh, I have the one solution. We're just going to use Chainlink. So just kind of go through first principles, think through, okay, what kind of attacks are still possible if you use that. And then I think that's kind of good, yeah. A lot of the hacks that happen are very preventable.
Yeah. Does UniV3's concentrated liquidity change anything? Because I think a lot of the attacks were based on just the XYK, the regular V2, right?
Concentrated liquidity, so you can still manipulate the price with concentrated liquidity. It just changes kind of the curve, right? So it's much more centered along where the current price is. So hacks are still possible. And also, I think there's not so many projects yet that kind of reference UniV3. The reason is, I think David talked about this earlier, but you have to kind of customize the ranges for deposits. So there are projects that are trying to make it easy to deposit into UniV3, but those would kind of be susceptible to potential attacks like this. But it's kind of slightly more trickier UX now to do these deposits.
But I think it would be manipulable. It just takes more capital, right?
Yeah,
liquidity.
It just takes more capital. So basically, a lot of times, what we try to do is basically do the math for the projects to figure out, okay, how much capital do you need, based on the current market conditions, and what times would this attack be possible. So a lot of times, it's basically just trying to do the math for them. Any other questions? Okay, if not, then thanks a lot.